Eila Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram Hoiledes Yitzchak. These are the stories, these are the generations of Yitzchak, the son of Avram. Avram is the father of Yitzchak. So it's obviously repetitive, it's redundant. Yitzchak is the son of Avram. First of all, we know that anyway, but even if you want to say that was his last name, Ben Avram, okay? And then it says, Avram Hoiledes Yitzchak. What the pasuk seems to be telling us is that we have to understand that there's a very strong kesher, a very strong relationship between Avram and Yitzchak, besides just being father and son. What Avram Avinu means and what he represents in terms of Avodas Hashem and our personal development, and what Yitzchak Avinu means in terms of Avodas Hashem and our personal development, Eila Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram Hoiledes Yitzchak. They're bound to each other. They're bound to each other. So let's investigate a little bit of what Avram Avinu means and what Yitzchak Avinu means in terms of Avodas Hashem, in terms of our own personal growth, and we'll see how they relate to each other. All right, so when it comes to Avram and Yitzchak, an interesting way how to go about sort of studying them and understanding what they mean in terms of the soul would be to look at the children that they produced. Not the good children, not like Yitzchak and Yaakov, but the ones on the other side, Yishmael versus Esav. And that's really what our parsha is also about. Obviously, Esav is a major personality in the parsha with the whole story of the brachas and so on. And even we have him trying to connect to Yishmael, right? At the end of the parsha, Esav marries the daughter of Yishmael, Machlas bas Yishmael. And so let's take a look at Yishmael versus Esav. And I think there's something very interesting that you see when you sort of compare and contrast them. Which one was worse? Which one is a greater enemy to the Jewish people? So it's interesting. Yishmael, Chazal say, on the one hand, there's something very special about Yishmael, and there's something about him that was not terribly terrible, that was not so bad. Chazal say that Yishmael at the end of his life did tshuva. Yishmael did tshuva at the end of his life, and in fact, you see this in the end of the parsha, that when Avram Avinu is nifter, so Yitzchak and Yishmael bury Avram Avinu, and it's clear, Chazal make a point of this, the pasuk even indicates this, that Yishmael humbled himself before Yitzchak. They allowed Yitzchak to be the one in charge sort of the Levi and so on. Even though Yishmael was older, he gave kavod to Yitzchak, and that was a siman of the tshuva that he experienced. So Keturah, right? His mother did tshuva, Yishmael does tshuva. Now by Esav, we don't find such a thing that Esav does tshuva. So that would seem to indicate that Yishmael was greater, had a higher level, and was more influenced by Avram Avinu than Esav was influenced by Yitzchak. Right? Because Avram Avinu was able to influence Yishmael to such a degree that at least at the end of his life he does tshuva. Whereas Esav doesn't have that. Now Mitzat Sheni, on the other hand, we find there's something unique in terms of how Yitzchak was able to influence Esav as opposed to how Avram was unable to influence Yishmael in the following way. We know that Yishmael, no part of him is buried in Maras Machpelah. Whereas Esav, we know that his head is buried in Maras Machpelah. Now, it's interesting that the whole story behind Esav's head being buried in Maras Machpelah, we know that it was at the time where Yaakov was Yaakov was nifter. They were burying him in Maras Machpelah and so on. And Esav comes, and it's a whole thing. He puts up the fight, and we know that he eventually is killed by Chushan ben Dan, Yaakov's grandson. And the Gemara says, Chazal say that his head rolled into Maras Machpelah. Now, that can't just be a coincidence. The Gemara tells us in a number of places, we have a general rule that you're not allowed to have a Rasha buried next to a tzaddik. More than that you're not allowed to, Chazal, we have stories of this where you would have people, not necessarily Rishayim, but just people that were not the biggest of tzaddikim, that were mistakenly buried next to certain Tanaim and Amoraim, and miraculously, the person was resurrected just in order to leave. There's stories like this, even by Nevi'im, the Gemara talks about stories like this. So if the halacha is that you can't bury a Rasha next to a tzaddik, right? And more than that, we find that by big tzaddikim, miracles actually happened to ensure that a Rasha wouldn't be buried next to them. So the fact that Esav's head is buried in Maras Machpelah must tell you that the head of Esav was sanctified, was not a rasha, was not unholy. It was taka the influence of Yitzchak over Yishmael, over Esav, was able to sanctify the head of Esav. Now we don't find that when it comes to Yishmael. Another thing we find by Esav that we don't find by Yishmael, actually, yeah.
By the brachos, he says Yadayim Yidei Esav.
So that could be indicative of this nakuda, right? It doesn't mention the head, right? But here's the question, though: if Avram Avinu's influence over Yishmael was so great that ad kedei kach that Yishmael at the end of the day did tshuva, then and Esav's influence and Yitzchak's influence over Esav was ad kedei kach that his head was able to be buried in Maras Machpelah, then why don't we find the head of Yishmael being buried in Maras Machpelah? Why don't we find Esav doing tshuva? It's like mitzad echad, Avram's influence was able to motivate tshuva, and Yitzchak's influence was able to change the head of Esav. Why the difference? We also find another interesting nakuda. I think that Chazal say that Yishmael had the halachic status of a guy, 100%. Never at any point did Yishmael have the status of a yid. Not so with Esav. Esav, Chazal call him a Yisrael mummer, a yid that went off. Now it's true that once they become bar mitzvah, and sort of they make that choice of Yaakov chooses to be a yid and Esav chooses to go off, then he's no longer considered to be a yid. But at least for the time being, he definitely had at some point the status of Yisrael. He was given a bris at 8 days. He was given the status of Yisrael. So again, we don't find that with Yishmael either. So this is like a little bit of the stira. On the one hand, we have a maila that Yishmael has in terms of the kedusha that was imbued within him by his father and his stepmother, the fact that he does tshuva. But mitzad sheni, by Esav you don't have that quality. But mitzad sheni, Esav has the influence of his parents in terms of the fact that his head is buried in Maras Machpelah, and for whatever time it was, for those number of years, he was considered a Yisrael. So how do we figure this out? Another interesting nakuda that we find a difference between Avram Avinu and Yitzchak Avinu is also in the parsha, which is in terms of whether they're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Right? We know there's a famine in Parshas Lech Lecha. After Avram Avinu gets to the land, there's a famine, and what happens? So he goes to Mitzrayim, and Hashem doesn't stop him. Adrabah, but he goes to Mitzrayim. He's successful. He comes out of Mitzrayim with a lot of wealth, and it was a good thing. Mitzad Sheni, when it comes to Yitzchak, there's also a famine, and Hashem says, you want to do what Avram Avinu was going to do, I'm not allowing that. You have to stay in Eretz Yisrael. So there's different interpretations, different reasons. One famous thing is that he was a carbon because of the Akedah, and therefore there would be a psul, there would be a psul that would kick in if you were to leave the boundaries of Kedushas Aretz. But halay davarhu. Another thing that we find with Avram versus Yitzchak is that with Avram Avinu we find that at least the parnasa that we see him involved with was mostly with cattle. That seems to be the parnas that he had with livestock. It mostly came from Mitzrayim, livestock. When it comes to Yitzchak Avinu, we see that the occupation he had was with planting, more agricultural. Yizra, he plants and he has me'asharim, the 100-fold of what he planted. He was matzliach in that. Certainly he had cattle from his father, that's for sure, but the pasuk talks about his ability to plant, and we also find this preoccupation with Yitzchak in terms of digging wells. Right, that's another thing that we find. Again, not so with Avram Avinu. Even though Avram Avinu had wells, but it's not a major focus of his entire life. It seems to be like a major in with Yitzchak Avinu. So all these nakudas, there's something, so it's putting all this together or laying it out on the table, there's something different between Avram and Yitzchak. There's something different within themselves. Avram Avinu goes out of Eretz Yisrael, Yitzchak doesn't. Avram Avinu is involved with cattle, Yitzchak is involved with like farming. And the wells of Yitzchak Avinu, and in terms of the influence they have on their children, is very different. On the one hand, there seems to be a maila of Yitzchak's influence on Esav. Mitzad Sheni, a maila of Avram Avinu's influence on Yishmael. So how do we put this together? Okay, so this is the idea. In the Sorach Darshan, we find that there's two levels of hashpah that one yid could have on another, a parent to a child, friends, husband and wife, you name it. Any level of hashpah, there's always two levels of hashpah. One is called where the mashpia gives over to the makabel, to the recipient, what's called an or makif, a surrounding light. That's one type of hashpah. The other type of hashpah that we find is when the person is mashpia, what's called an or pnimi, an inner light. What's the difference? And by the way, both these things are happening, for example, by chassan and kala. That's one of the fundamental differences between kedushin and nisuin. By kedushin, the relationship is being forged. It's called an or makif. Nesuin is called an arpinini. Okay, what does this mean? So very simple, give a very pashut example. There are some times in a person's life where a person finds themselves in a very inspiring and uplifted and holy environment. Let's say you go to a tzaddik, right? You go to a tzaddik, or you go to a holy experience, you go to a farbrengen or a siyum, or you go to a minyan, right? And well, that's what I'm not going to say, whatever. So it's such a thing. So when you go to such places like that, all of a sudden, your personal standards are raised. Sometimes they're raised just because that's what everyone else is doing, so you have to sort of follow the what everyone's doing. But more than that, very often, within yourself, you feel that your standards are higher because you're in a holy atmosphere, in a holy environment. But then what invariably happens is that when you leave the tzaddik's audience, or the farbrengen's over, or the shir's over, then what? Then usually you go back to the way you were. So how do we define what just happened there, like during that time? Again, if it was just a matter of conforming, everyone's davening, so I'll daven. Everyone's learning, so I'll learn. Everyone's chuckling and singing, so I'll sing along. If it's just conforming, it's just conforming. Then obviously nothing happened. But we're talking about sometimes a person really feels that they were changed, like something really. They feel different during that farbrengen, during that audience with the tzaddik. But yet, ultimately, it goes away when you're gone. So how do we explain that? The explanation is as follows, that what happened during the time that you were in that holy environment, by the tzaddik or whatever, that was a real thing. But what's happening is that the tzaddik was being mashpia on you, or that environment was being mashpia on you, what's called an armakif, a surrounding light. A surrounding light means a level of light, a level of kedusha, that's not penetrating the very core of who you are, to change who you are from within, from sort of bottom up. It's not. This is a light that's sort of descending upon you from above to below. And you're sort of getting swept up in the madrega, or at least partially in the madrega of the tzaddik that you're in front of. Or you're getting swept up in the madrega of the general olam that you're a part of. And that's a real hashpah. That's not insignificant. That's a real hashpah. But that's a hashpah that has a maila and a chesaron. The chesaron of such a hashpah is that because it's not penetrating your very essence, it's not changing you from within. So because of that, when you're taken out of the environment, then you go back. Mitzad Sheni, however, this level of hashpah of an armakif could, at least for the time being, raise you up to madregas that otherwise would take you years to reach. So this is such a phenomenon where a person very quickly, and very somewhat easily, being in the right atmosphere, in the right place, can be like sort of upgraded a lot of madregas. And for that time being, it's legitimately and truthfully, you're holding in a big place. But ultimately, the madregas that you're experiencing are, since they're coming from an armakiv, generated from the sviva around you, and they're not constricted, they're not custom made to who you are. It's just that you are entering into this atmosphere of kedusha. So on the one hand, it can take you to very high places that would take otherwise years to reach, but mitzad echad, mitzad sheni, it's not yours. And when you leave that atmosphere, it goes back. Avram Avinu's inyan was an armakif. Avram Avinu, for example, Chazal say, when Hashem said in the beginning of creation, Yehi, or let there be light, Chazal say, Zeh Avram, that's Avram. The light of creation, it wasn't the sun even, it was the light that the Chazal say you could see from one end of the universe to the other. That's a surrounding light. That's a light that envelops all of creation all at once. Avram Avinu, therefore we find this, that Avram Avinu's life, his dream was not to have a specific people. Avram Avinu's dream was Lu Yishmol Yichel V'Necha. Avram Avinu wanted the whole world to be converted. Avram Avinu was very big. Avram Avinu saw from that forest perspective. And Avram Avinu's therefore you find this, that Avram Avinu's influence over Yishmael was one of an armakif. That Yishmael, wherever Yishmael went, the surrounding light of Avram Avinu traveled with him. Now that is a maila. The maila of that is that light of Avram Avinu was so powerful, and it could raise, and it raised Yishmael to madregas that technically were way above him. So Yishmael does tshuva at the end of his life. And Avram Avinu humbles himself, and Yishmael humbles himself to Yitzchak. And that madrega that Yishmael reaches is because of the unbelievable influence and the overwhelming presence of Avram Avinu in Yishmael's life, so much so that even after Avram Avinu was nifter, Yishmael was still affected by that. But at the end of the day, Yishmael himself was not changed. This was the tshuva that he did, the avodah that he did, and the madregas that he might have reached at the end of his life. It was because of that atmosphere that Avram Avinu put him under. But Yishmael himself is unchanged, and because of that, never at any point does he have a status of a yid. He doesn't have that status. This is why Avram Avinu, his preoccupation in life was with animals roaming, traveling, nomadic on some level. Avram Avinu himself is nomadic. He travels all the way to Chutz La'aretz. The light of Avram Avinu since it doesn't have to penetrate the very core and the very essence of what it comes in contact with, so it doesn't mind. It could be in Chutz La'aretz too. You understand? It doesn't that sviva, that or makav, that surrounding light. You want to put a Yishmael in it, gesundheit. You want to put this guy in it, put chelp in it, put all sorts of it, because the light of Avram Avinu. When you have a farbrengen, the more the merrier, because it's not about trying to fit into the consciousness of the individual people to change them from within. We are creating in an atmosphere, an environment that's bigger than everyone anyway, and so everyone comes in, and for the time being, you're elevated. So Avram Avinu can travel to Chutz La'aretz, and his light isn't dulled by that, because his light was a light that wasn't trying to fit into the particular place anyway. It was just a surrounding light from one end of the universe to the other. That's Avram Avinu. Yitzchak is very different. If Avram Avinu was a surrounding light, and that was his influence, Yitzchak Avinu means in our opinion an inner light. Now, an inner light is a different type of hashpah. An inner light means a more focused, a more constricted approach, where the tzaddik is mashpia on the Talmud, not in this way of like, you're in my audience and therefore you're going to be uplifted by just being in my presence. The second way of the Arpnimi is that tzaddik is giving specific and small doses to his Talmidim in a way that they could digest it, in a way that it penetrates who they are, and it changes them from within. Whereas Avram Avinu, you can sort of describe it as a light that comes from above to below, which just overwhelms everything below, but it doesn't really change it either. Whereas Yitzchak Avinu is a light that sort of goes from below to above. It's a pill that Yitzchak that his Talmidim eat.
What's better?
So the truth is, it's hard to say what's better, because ultimately that's what we're going to see with Yaakov Avinu. You need both, because on the one hand, there's a maila in Yitzchak, right, in the fact that the person himself is changed from within. And therefore, just going back for a second, that's why you find that the preoccupation of Yitzchak is what? Is agricultural, is farming. Something that grows, it grows from the ground, bottom up. Not an overwhelming light, and it's not a nomadic lifestyle either. Yitzchak cannot go to Chutz La'aretz because the light of Yitzchak is a light that's specific and custom-made to the makabel, to the specific receiver. And therefore, the receiver has to be worthy of receiving that. And because of that, Chutz La'aretz was not a place for the light of Yitzchak, because the light of Yitzchak can't be consumed by the place of Chutz La'aretz. It's not a shidduch. Chutz La'aretz was not ready to receive that light. The light of Avram Avinu it's overwhelming anyway. It doesn't recognize different madregas of whether you're holding, not holding. The Farbrengen is happening. It might as well come. Whereas opposed to Yitzchak, it's more custom made, and that madrega, there's more of a discerning eye. Who's able to receive, who's holding by receiving that light, who's ready to be changed from within and who's not. This is why Esav, the child of Yitzchak, was influenced by the light of Yitzchak Avinu. And for the time being, for those years, till Bar Mitzvah, he was called a Yid. Not like Yishmael that he himself never became a Yid. Yishmael was always just under the spell of Avram Avinu. And that's Gavaldik, but he himself was never changed. Esav was changed, and because of that he has the status of a Yid. But here's the Nakuda. This is where Avram Avinu has a Maila over Yitzchak. Because Yitzchak's light is more mugbal, more mitzumtzum, more specific, and needs the recipient to accept it, the light of Yitzchak was only able to get to the head of Esav. Right? Remember we said before that the head of Esav makes his way to Maras Machpelah. Whereas Yishmael, his whole essence, he did tshuva, his whole body did tshuva. So why didn't the whole body of Yishmael end up in Maras Machpelah? But that's the difference. When you're influenced by the Or Makif, so mitzad echad, it's not you. So it's not your madregas. But mitzad sheni, to whatever extent you're able to sort of be mishtatev and be a part of that experience, it's your entirety that's part of that experience, and every part of you is uplifted. Albeit you're being uplifted because of the experience. But when it comes to Yitzchak, the person is being changed. But because it's a real change that's happening from within, then lav davka is there a guarantee that every single part of you is going to be changed. It's going to be much more mitzumsa, much more constricted to specific parts of your Yiddishkeit that you're holding by fixing, and certain parts not. This is why you find this, that there are certain moments of inspiration, like I give the example, give a Farbrengen, or whatever the case may be, when you're in the audience of a tzaddik.
Tonight, guys.
Bez Hashem. What do you think I'm keeping talking about Farbrengens? So yeah, Bez Hashem, yeah. So
What's going on?
yeah, right, exactly.
What's happening?
Every Thursday night, it's always Farbrengen by you. That's what it is.
Because my head is just like.
Well, listen. So
all the voices inside.
Yeah. So when it comes to that type of experience, the growth that a person can have, every single part of the person's Yiddishkeit can be accelerated to higher madregas. But again, it's not his. Mitzat Sheni, when it's a Yitzchak Avinu Inyan, so then whatever growth that you have is mamish yours, but lav davka is every part of you growing. It's more mugbal to particular areas. And this is the difference between Yitzchak and Yishmael. And this is why, again, Esav, his head is completely changed by Yitzchak and gets to Maras Machpelah, but that light of Yitzchak did not penetrate anywhere lower than just his head. Then comes Yaakov Avinu. So Yaakov Avinu is an amazing thing. Yaakov Avinu says in Pasuk, he's Yoshev Olam. He sits in the tents of Avram and Yitzchak. Yaakov Avinu is the synthesis of both. Yaakov Avinu learns how you go to a Farbrengen, you experience that Or Makif, that's the Avram Avinu, but then you take that experience and you then try to internalize it, at least to a certain degree. It's not practical and it's not real to think that the entire inspiration you had in the audience of the tzaddik, or by the Farbrengen, or by those big experiences, it's not practical to think that you're going to internalize every aspect of it. Because that's the nature of an Or Makif. The nature of Avram Avinu is that it's all-encompassing, but it's not yours. What you then have to do is take that overwhelming experience and then transition to Yitzchak and take at least a part of it and make it yours. And at least sanctify your head or your hands or your feet. And then what you're doing is synthesizing, is bringing together. You take the general surrounding light of Avram and you take that surrounding light and you turn that into, whatever degree is possible, you turn that into an inner light. And slowly but surely that's how you ascend. Because ultimately, what you're able to do with time is that every single part of that surrounding light could ultimately be turned into an inner light. And then you have to upgrade your Farbrengens. Then you have to upgrade the tzaddikim that you go to. And then you experience a greater surrounding light. And then you slowly but surely turn that into an inner light. And then you upgrade your Farbrengens again. And that's how you ascend. This is the secret of Nasa v'Nishma. When the Jewish people say Nasa v'Nishma, what does Nasa v'Nishma mean? Nasa means inner light. Nasa means we are going to change from within. We're going to make serious changes to who we are and to grow internally, like Yitzchak. And from there, we're going to attach ourselves to an even greater surrounding light. That's called Nishma. We'll hear, we'll listen, we'll just experience something bigger than us. And that's the progression that a Yid goes through. Elo told us Yitzchak ben Avram Hoyled is Yitzchak. Avram and Yitzchak have to be bound together. And this is the progression of how a Yid grows. You first allow yourself to be swept up in something bigger than you, and recognize that at that time, on the one hand, for that time you're being elevated to higher places, but mitzvah sheni, it's not yours yet. And then you take that inspiration, you take that experience, and you make real, specific, but small changes based on that. And then you're slowly but surely uniting these two worlds of Avram and Yitzchak. And that's Bez Hashem what you want. What you want to be is to be someone that's able to bring the two together, to be Yaakov Avinu, Ishtam, Yeshiv Avnu. So Hashem should help us. We should be zeicha to grow, and that's the halacha dvarim. Our makif to our pnimi, to our makif again, to our pnimi again. Okay, should be zeicha to become yidden.